In the year 897, they dug up a dead pope. They literally pulled the rotting corpse of Pope Formosus out of his grave, dressed him in full papal robes, propped him up on a throne, and put him on trial. A living pope, Stephen VI, stood across the room screaming accusations at a dead body. They assigned a teenage deacon to stand behind the corpse and answer on his behalf. When the trial was over, they found Formosus guilty, hacked off the 3 fingers he used to give blessings, stripped the robes from his decaying frame, and dumped what was left of him into the Tiber River. This is not ancient mythology. This is documented history. This happened inside the most powerful institution the human race has ever produced. And here is what should bother you. It is not that this happened, it is that the institution that did this is still here, still operating, still one of the wealthiest, most politically connected, most psychologically sophisticated organizations on the planet 2,000 years later. Empires rise and collapse in centuries. Corporations barely survive decades. Governments get overthrown in a single generation. But the Catholic Church has outlasted every single empire, kingdom, government, and dynasty that has ever existed on Earth. And today, you are going to learn exactly how they did it. Not the spiritual version they teach in Sunday school, the real version. The version built on psychological manipulation, information control, financial exploitation, and a political strategy so advanced it makes modern governments look like amateurs. You are not ready for this, but let us begin anyway. Every con artist, every cult leader, every dictator in history has understood one principle. If you want to control people, you need a monopoly on something they desperately need. For drug cartels, it is the product. For authoritarian governments, it is safety. For the Catholic Church, it was something far more powerful than any of those things. They monopolized the afterlife. Think about what that means for a moment. Really think about it. In the medieval world, the average person lived to about 35. Life was brutal. Famine, plague, war, poverty. Suffering was not the exception. It was the default setting of human existence. The only hope anyone had was that this miserable life was not all there was, that something better waited after death. And the Catholic Church positioned itself as the only gateway to that something better. Not one of the gateways, the only one. This was not a gentle theological suggestion. This was an absolute, non-negotiable claim enforced by every mechanism of social power available. Outside the Church, there is no salvation. That phrase, extra ecclesiam nulla salus, was not just a slogan. It was official church doctrine for over 1,000 years. It meant that no matter how good you were, no matter how moral your life, no matter how kind or generous or decent, if you were not a baptized, practicing Catholic in good standing with Rome, you were going to hell. Period. Not purgatory, hell forever. Now, imagine you believe that. Imagine everyone around you believes that. Imagine your parents taught it to you before you could read. Your community reinforced it every single day. And the only people educated enough to challenge it were priests, who had every incentive to keep teaching it. You are not choosing Catholicism at that point. You are trapped in it. The exit door has been welded shut with the threat of eternal torture. And that is the first system of control. You do not need chains if you can convince people that leaving is worse than staying. The church did not imprison bodies. It imprisoned minds. And it did it so effectively that for over a millennium, the vast majority of Europeans never even considered the possibility that the church might be wrong. Not because the evidence was strong, but because questioning the church meant risking your eternal soul, and no one was willing to take that bet. But controlling the afterlife was just the foundation. What they built on top of it was far more sinister and far more brilliant. What if I told you the Catholic Church invented the most sophisticated surveillance system in history and people walked into it voluntarily? Before the NSA, before the KGB, before any modern intelligence agency even existed, the Catholic Church had already built a surveillance network that covered all of Western Europe. It operated in every village, every town, every city. It had millions of informants. It ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for over 1,000 years. It was called confession. Think about the genius of this for a moment. Every other surveillance system in history has had the same fundamental problem. People do not want to be watched. You have to build cameras, recruit spies, crack encryptions, monitor communications. It is expensive, it is labor-intensive, and people resist it. The Catholic Church solved all of these problems with a single innovation. They convinced people that being surveilled was good for them, that it was spiritually necessary, that if they did not walk into a small box and tell a priest every bad thing they had ever done, they would burn in hell. The information that flowed through the confessional was staggering. Affairs, crimes, conspiracies, business dealings, family secrets, political opinions, doubts, fears, weaknesses. Every single vulnerability a person had delivered directly to the church in their own words, and not just from peasants. Kings confessed, nobles confessed, generals, merchants, judges. Everyone confessed, because everyone believed they had to. Now, technically, priests were bound by the seal of confession. They were not supposed to share what they heard, and many individual priests honored that seal. But the institution itself benefited enormously regardless. A priest who heard confessions from every major family in a town understood the social dynamics of that community better than anyone alive. He knew who was cheating, on whom, who was stealing, who was plotting against the local lord. He did not need to share specific confessions to wield that knowledge. The patterns alone were enough, and at higher levels the seal was far more flexible than the church publicly admitted. Papal dispensations could release a priest from the seal in certain cases. Political confessions were sometimes quietly relayed to Rome. During the Inquisition, the line between confession and interrogation was deliberately blurred. Penitents who confessed heretical thoughts in the confessional sometimes found themselves facing an inquisitor the following week. But the real power of confession was not intelligence gathering, it was psychological conditioning. Confession trained people from childhood to internalize the idea that they were fundamentally broken, that they were sinners by nature, that they needed the church to be made whole. Every week, you walked into that box and recited your failures. Every week, a priest told you what to do to make it right. Over time, that rhythm does something to a person's psychology. It creates dependency. It makes the church not just a place you go on Sundays, but the regulator of your inner life. That is not religion. That is behavioral engineering. every system of power needs a punishment mechanism. Governments have prisons, militaries have courts-martial, crime syndicates have violence, but the Catholic Church had something none of those institutions could match. They had hell. Not just the concept of a bad afterlife, other religions had versions of that. The Church's innovation was specificity. They did not leave hell vague or abstract. They made it vivid, detailed, and absolutely terrifying. Fire that burned but never consumed. Pain that intensified but never killed. Demons with specific jobs and specific methods of torture. An eternity, not a long time, an actual infinity of the worst suffering imaginable, with zero possibility of escape or relief. And they did not just preach about it in sermons, they weaponized art. Walk into any medieval cathedral and look at the imagery, the frescoes, the carvings, the stained glass. Hell is everywhere. Grotesque, nightmarish scenes of human bodies twisted in agony, demons tearing flesh, flames engulfing the damned. This was not accidental decoration. This was strategic psychological warfare. In a world where most people could not read, images were the primary medium of communication. And the Church made absolutely certain that the most powerful, most emotionally overwhelming images in every community were images of what happened to people who disobeyed. But hell was the nuclear option. For day-to-day enforcement, the Church had a more surgical tool: excommunication. Being excommunicated did not just mean you could not go to church, it meant you were cut off from the sacraments, which meant you were cut off from salvation, which meant you were going to hell. But the temporal consequences were almost as devastating. An excommunicated person became a social leper. No one could do business with them without risking their own soul. No one could eat with them, shelter them, or even speak to them. In a medieval community where the Church was the center of all social life, excommunication was a death sentence, socially, economically, and spiritually. And the Church did not just use excommunication against individuals, they used it against entire nations. When a king defied the Pope could place the entire kingdom under interdict. That meant no masses, no marriages, no baptisms, no confessions, no burials with last rites, nothing. Every person in that kingdom suddenly believed their eternal soul was in jeopardy because of their king's disobedience. The political pressure this created was immense. Kings who were untouchable by any army could be brought to their knees by a single papal declaration. The most famous example is Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire, who defied Pope Gregory VII in 1077. Gregory excommunicated him and released his subjects from their oaths of allegiance. Within months, Henry's own nobles were threatening to replace him. He was forced to cross the Alps in the dead of winter and stand barefoot in the snow outside the Pope's castle at Canossa for 3 days, begging for forgiveness. The most powerful secular ruler in Europe, humiliated and broken, not by an army, but by one old man's ability to weaponize fear. That is what an architecture of fear looks like when it is built properly. You do not need soldiers if you can make people police themselves. You do not need prisons if people believe the punishment is infinitely worse than anything a dungeon could deliver. The Catholic Church understood something that most institutions still do not. The most effective prison is one the inmates cannot see. Fear kept them obedient. Guilt kept them coming back. But the Church had one more lock on the cage, and this one was the most insidious of all. For over 1,000 years, the Catholic Church kept the most important book in Western civilization locked in a language nobody spoke, and they killed the people who tried to translate it. This is the part most people skip over because it sounds like a minor historical footnote. It is not. It might be the single most important mechanism of control the Church ever deployed, because it made all of the other mechanisms possible. The Bible was kept in Latin. Not because Latin was a sacred language, the original texts were written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Not because the translation was too difficult, scholars had been capable of translating it for centuries. The Bible was kept in Latin because Latin was a language the common person could not read, could not speak, and could not learn without access to education that was controlled entirely by the Church. Think about what this means practically. The foundational text of the entire religion, the book that supposedly contained God's direct instructions for how to live and how to be saved, was completely inaccessible to the people who needed it most. The only way to know what God wanted was to ask a priest, and the priest could tell you whatever he wanted, because you had no way to check. This is not speculation. We know that medieval church teachings often contradicted or dramatically distorted the actual content of the Bible. Doctrines like purgatory, indulgences, the supreme authority of the Pope, mandatory clerical celibacy, the worship of saints and relics, these were presented as biblical truth to populations who had no way to verify the claim. The Church was not just interpreting Scripture, it was rewriting it in real time with no accountability, because the audience could not read the source material. And when someone tried to change that, the Church responded with violence. John Wycliffe produced the first complete English translation of the Bible in the 1380s. The Church declared him a heretic. 44 years after his death, they dug up his bones, burned them, and scattered the ashes in a river. William Tyndale printed the first English Bible from the original Greek in 1526. He was hunted across Europe for years, finally captured in Belgium, strangled, and burned at the stake. His crime was not blasphemy, it was translation, because the Church understood something critical. The moment people could read the Bible for themselves, the entire monopoly collapsed. They would discover that half of what they had been taught was not in the text at all. They would discover that the massive institutional hierarchy, the wealth, the political power, the layers of ritual and bureaucracy, none of it was mandated by the book the Church claimed as its source of authority. And that is exactly what happened. When Martin Luther translated the Bible into German and the printing press made it widely available, the Reformation exploded across Europe within a single generation. Not because Luther was a brilliant theologian, but because, for the first time in 1,000 years, people could read for themselves. And what they read did not match what they had been told. The knowledge lock was not an accident, it was not laziness, it was the deliberate, strategic suppression of information to maintain power. And it worked for over a millennium. In the modern world, we call that censorship. In the medieval world, they called it the will of God. But even with guilt, fear, and ignorance working in their favor, the Church needed one more thing. The one thing every institution needs to survive long-term: money. And the way they got it might be the most audacious con in history. The Catholic Church literally sold tickets out of hell, and it was the most profitable business model the world had ever seen. If you want to understand the true financial genius of the Catholic Church, forget everything you know about modern economics. What the Church built was not a business in any conventional sense. It was a machine that converted human fear into revenue, and it operated at a scale that no corporation in history has matched. The foundation was the tithe, a mandatory 10% tax on all income, enforced not by law enforcement, but by the threat of damnation. 10% of everything, from every person, in every parish, across all of Europe, for over 1,000 years. No government in the medieval world had the administrative capacity to collect taxes with that kind of efficiency. The Church did, because it had a collection agent in every single village, the parish priest, and an enforcement mechanism that no government could match, the terror of hell. But tithing was just the baseline. The real money came from selling salvation directly. Indulgences were the Church's masterpiece of financial engineering. The concept was elegant in its cynicism. The Church declared that even after confession, sin left a residue, a debt of temporal punishment that had to be paid off, either through suffering in purgatory or through an indulgence granted by the Church. And starting in the 11th century, the Church began selling those indulgences for cash. At first, indulgences were tied to specific acts of piety, going on a crusade, making a pilgrimage, donating to a specific construction project. But over time, the system became nakedly transactional. By the late medieval period, professional indulgence sellers traveled across Europe like traveling salesmen, with printed receipts and tiered pricing. Johann Tetzel, the most notorious of these sellers, reportedly told crowds that the moment their coin hit the bottom of the collection box, a soul would spring from purgatory into heaven. He was essentially running an infomercial for the afterlife. And it was not just indulgences for yourself. You could buy them for dead relatives, your mother, your father, your children who died in infancy. If they were suffering in purgatory, you could pay to get them out. Imagine the psychological leverage of that. You are a poor farmer who just lost a child. A man in church robes tells you that your baby is suffering right now in purgatory and will continue to suffer unless you pay. What are you going to do? Of course you pay. You sell your livestock if you have to, because what kind of parent would not? The revenue was staggering. Indulgence sales funded some of the most expensive construction projects in human history. St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, one of the largest, most ornate buildings ever constructed, was built substantially on indulgence money. The Church was essentially financing a real estate empire on guilt and grief. But the money machine extended far beyond indulgences. The Church accumulated land on a scale that would make modern real estate developers weep. Dying parishioners were encouraged, pressured to leave property to the Church in their wills as a final act of piety. Over centuries, this turned the Church into the single largest landowner in Europe. By some estimates, the medieval Church owned between a quarter and a third of all cultivable land in Western Europe. That land generated rents, agricultural income, and political leverage that rivaled or exceeded the wealth of most kingdoms. And unlike a kingdom, the Church never divided its inheritance. It never split between heirs. It never lost territory in succession crises. The wealth only accumulated century after century, compounding with a patience that no human institution could match, because the Church operated on an infinite time horizon. Kings think in decades. The Church thought in millennia. With money came political power. And the church did not just participate in politics, it invented a system where it stood above every king, every emperor, every government on earth. This is where the Catholic Church moves from being a religious institution to being the most sophisticated political machine in human history. Because the Church did not just influence politics, it created a framework in which the Pope was, by doctrinal definition, the supreme authority on earth, above every king, every emperor, every government, every law. The doctrine was called papal supremacy, and it was not subtle. Pope Boniface VIII declared in 1302 that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. Not recommended, not helpful. Necessary for salvation, meaning if you defy the Pope, you go to hell. And since the Pope was the one who decided what defying meant, this effectively made him the supreme judge of every political dispute in Christendom. The Church used this authority with surgical precision. The Pope could crown emperors, and he could uncrown them. He could legitimize a king's rule, and he could delegitimize it with a single letter. He could call a crusade, redirecting the military resources of entire nations toward whatever target he chose. He could form and dissolve alliances, settle territorial disputes, and override any local law that conflicted with church doctrine. But the Church's political genius was not brute force. It was strategic positioning. The Church deliberately maintained a balance of power among European monarchies, ensuring that no single secular ruler ever became powerful enough to challenge Rome. When France grew too strong, the Church supported England. When the Holy Roman Emperor grew too ambitious, the Church backed his rivals. The Pope operated like a chess grandmaster, moving kingdoms like pieces on a board, always ensuring that the most powerful player at the table was Rome itself. The Crusades were perhaps the most dramatic demonstration of this political power. When Pope Urban II called the First Crusade in 1095, he did not command a single soldier. He had no army, no navy, no logistics chain. All he had was a speech, and that speech mobilized tens of thousands of armed men from across Europe, convinced them to leave their homes and families, march thousands of miles across hostile territory, and fight and die for a city most of them had never seen. No military commander in history had that kind of recruiting power. No government could have mobilized a comparable force. The Pope did it with words, because the words carried the weight of heaven and hell behind them. And the Church played the long game better than any political entity in history. When it faced a powerful adversary, it did not always fight. Sometimes it absorbed, sometimes it waited. When Viking raiders terrorized northern Europe, the Church did not defeat them militarily. It converted them. Within a few generations, the descendants of the men who had burned monasteries were building them. When the Frankish Empire fractured, the Church was there to fill the power vacuum. When the Roman Empire fell, the Church did not fall with it. It stepped into the void and became the de facto administrative structure of Western Europe. This adaptability is not something you see in other institutions. Governments are rigid. Empires are brittle. The Church was fluid, capable of being a theocracy, a feudal lord, a diplomatic power broker, a cultural institution, or a shadow government, depending on what the situation required. That flexibility is what made it unkillable. But every system of power eventually faces a crisis. The Church faced dozens and survived every single one. How? That is where the real lesson begins. The Reformation should have killed the Catholic Church, the Enlightenment should have buried it, the sexual abuse scandals should have finished it. None of them did. That tells you something terrifying about how this institution operates. This is the part of the story that should genuinely unsettle you. Because everything we have discussed so far, the guilt, the fear, the knowledge suppression, the money, the politics, those are impressive but comprehensible systems of control. What the church does when it faces an existential threat goes beyond impressive into something that is almost alien in its strategic intelligence. The Catholic Church has survived the fall of the Roman Empire, the Great Schism, the Black Death, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the rise of communism, 2 world wars, and decades of abuse scandals. Every single one of these events destroyed or permanently crippled other institutions that were far younger and far more powerful in conventional terms. The Church walked through all of them. The key is the playbook, and the playbook has 3 moves. Move 1, absorb and repackage. When the Church cannot defeat an idea, it absorbs it. Pagan holidays became Christian holidays. Christmas was placed on the winter solstice. Easter absorbed spring fertility rituals. Local gods became saints. This is not religious evolution, it is strategic assimilation. The Church looked at ideas that threatened to pull people away and said, we can offer that too. Every competitor became raw material. This continued long after the medieval period, when liberation theology emerged in Latin America, a movement that used Christian language to advocate for the poor against authoritarian governments. The Church initially resisted. But when the movement grew too large to suppress, the Church absorbed its language while stripping its radical politics. The Vatican co-opted the rhetoric of justice and compassion without accepting the structural critique. The revolutionary impulse was neutralized by being welcomed into the tent and then quietly smothered. Move 2. Sacrifice the branch to save the tree. When a crisis threatens the institution, the Church is ruthlessly willing to cut away compromised elements and blame them for the problem. When the Inquisition became politically untenable, it was gradually dismantled, but the Church never accepted institutional responsibility. Individual inquisitors were blamed. Local excesses were acknowledged. The system itself was never indicted. The same pattern played out with the sexual abuse scandals. Individual priests were defrocked or prosecuted. Local bishops were criticized for cover-ups. But the structural conditions that enabled the abuse, mandatory celibacy, extreme hierarchical authority, institutional secrecy, the theological framing of priests as conduits of God were never addressed at a systemic level. The branches were cut. The tree remained exactly as it was. Move 3. Outlast. This is the Church's ultimate weapon, and it is one that no other institution can replicate. The Church operates on a timescale that renders most opposition irrelevant. A hostile king will die. A reforming movement will lose energy. A scandal will fade from public memory. The Church simply has to wait. It has been doing this for 2,000 years, and it has learned that almost every threat resolves itself if you are patient enough. This is why the Church moves so slowly on everything. It is not institutional incompetence. It is a deliberate strategy. By the time the Church officially responds to a crisis, the crisis has often already passed. And in the meantime, the Church has used the intervening years to quietly adjust its positioning, update its messaging, and neutralize its critics. without ever appearing to have changed at all. The result is an institution that appears to be eternal, unchanging, divinely ordained, when in reality it is one of the most aggressively adaptive organizations in human history. It just operates on a time scale that makes the adaptation invisible to any single human lifetime,